The night everything shattered began as a celebration wrapped in warm lights, soft music, and the kind of laughter that makes a home feel alive. Though beneath that glowing surface something far heavier pulsed, invisible to everyone, but destined to change her life forever. She arrived hoping the evening might ease the tension of the past few weeks, believing, perhaps ingenuously, that a quiet moment together could mend what felt fractured. But the instant she stepped inside, she sensed an uneasiness threading through the air, an undercurrent too subtle to name, yet powerful enough to unsettle her heartbeat. From across the room, she saw him avoiding her gaze, his eyes darting toward doors and windows as though expecting an uninvited presence to slip in without sound. And that single detail struck her with a chill she could not explain. Though the ambience echoed with festive warmth, his posture betrayed a man battling something far deeper than fatigue or stress, and every time she tried to approach him, he drifted away with quiet reluctance, as if her nearness threatened the fragile balance he was barely holding together. When she offered a gentle smile, an attempt to recover their lost tenderness, he responded with a stiffness she had never seen, prompting a flicker of pain to spark within her chest. Around them, the guests continued celebrating, blissfully unaware that beneath their cheerful conversations, a storm of unspoken fear and desperation was brewing in the heart of the man she loved. She watched him closely, noticing details she had overlooked until then. The way he checked his phone with anxious precision, the shallow rise and fall of his breath, the tension etched across his brow every time a new voice echoed near the entrance. Something was wrong, profoundly wrong, but she could not grasp its shape. And before she could untangle her confusion, he raised his hand, signaling for silence. Conversations faded, laughter died out, and the room shifted into a realm of expectation so thick it felt like the air itself had frozen. In the stillness that followed, she felt her pulse pounding through her veins as though her body recognized the danger she could not yet see. The expression he wore, one of agony disguised as resolve, sent a tremor through her spine. She knew he was about to say something irreversible, but nothing could have prepared her for the blow that followed. And as he opened his mouth to speak, she realized too late that some truths arrive like cold steel, swift, sharp, and destined to cut into everything you believed you understood about love, loyalty, and sacrifice. This story is not simply about the end of a marriage. It is about the hidden battles fought in silence, the decisions that wound because they were never meant to be understood, and the devastating cost of loving someone so deeply that you are willing to become their villain to keep them alive. Tonight, you will witness how a single choice, brutal, incomprehensible, unforgettable, unravels into a truth that only reveals its meaning when the final piece falls into place. If stories like this stir something inside you, stay with us until the last moment, because the ending will change the way you interpret every detail of this night. And if you want more emotional, cinematic narratives like this one, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. He saw her step into the room with the hesitant hope de alguien que, en cree en la posibilidad de una reconciliación. Pero el brillo suave de las luces navideñas no lograba suavizar la tensión que se extendía entre ellos como un hilo invisible a punto de romperse. She approached slowly, trying to read his features, yet every small detail, his rigid shoulders, the stiffness in his jaw, the way his hand lingered near his phone, suggested a pressure he refused to name, a storm brewing behind his eyes that grew darker each time the door swung open or a shadow shifted across the room. Though she tried to convince herself he was simply overwhelmed, the distance he kept placing between them felt deliberate, as if he feared that even standing close to her might trigger consequences neither of them could undo. She paused near the table where the family had arranged trays of food, capturing the scene as though memorizing the final seconds of peace before something unseen unraveled it all. And as she observed him from afar, she noticed how he scanned the crowd with a vigilance that had nothing to do with discomfort or social fatigue. It was the gaze of a man anticipating danger, the gaze of someone who had already accepted that whatever approached could no longer be stopped. Her heart tightened, sensing a fracture larger than any previous argument. And though the room buzzed with cheerful conversations, she felt isolated inside a growing silence that only the two of them seemed to inhabit. When she finally gathered the courage to draw near, he took a single, involuntary step backward, a small movement that cut deep into her chest like a blade carved from cold disappointment, for it contradicted everything she hoped to salvage between them. She whispered his name, hoping to pull him out of that strange trance, but he pressed his lips together as if sealing words that could never be spoken aloud. Not here, not now, not in front of the people he desperately needed to protect. His eyes flickered toward her with a sorrow so raw it made her breath hitch, though she could not yet understand why that sorrow held the sharpness of a farewell. The evening unfolded with an uncanny slowness, each minute stretching into a taut thread as he drifted from group to group without truly engaging, offering distracted nods and forced smiles that dissolved the moment anyone tried to hold his attention. Meanwhile, she wandered behind him like a ghost tethered to memories that no longer matched the man standing before her. Memories of warmth and certainty that now felt like echoes from another life. Every attempt to speak to him collapsed under his evasive replies, and each rejection carved a deeper fissure inside her, one she tried desperately not to reveal to the guests who watched her with curious glances. Everything shifted when he suddenly straightened his posture, tapped his glass with trembling fingers. Why pidió silencio con una autoridad que hello el air al instant. Conversation stalled, chairs shifted, and all eyes turned toward him as though sensing instinctively that what he was about to say would not resemble any holiday toast. She felt the hairs on her arms rise while her pulse pounded against her ribcage, her body recognizing the gravity a fraction of a second before her mind did, and as he breathed in shakily, she sensed a fracture opening beneath her feet, widening with each heartbeat. The moment he met her eyes, time seemed to slow, allowing her to read 1,000 stories in that single look. Regret, fear, devotion, resignation, and a silent plea for forgiveness she did not yet understand. Then, with a voice that trembled despite his desperate attempt to hold it together, he announced the end of their marriage in front of everyone, slicing through her world with a cruelty so absolute she felt the room tilt around her. Gasps rippled across the gathering, but all she could hear was the collapsing echo of her own heartbeat, a sound that marked the exact second her life began to split apart under the weight of a truth she had not been allowed to hear. Her breath caught in her throat as the announcement settled over the room like a shroud, suffocating every fragment of joy that had existed only moments before, and though she tried to make sense of his words, they echoed in her mind in disjointed pieces, as if her brain refused to assemble them into something real. She reached for the edge of a chair to steady herself, fighting the sensation that the floor had tilted beneath her, and when she finally managed to lift her gaze, she found him, staring at the ground with the rigid stillness of someone bracing for impact. The murmurs rising around them felt distant, muffled, blurred by the ringing in her ears, and yet she sensed every pair of eyes fixed on her, waiting for her reaction as if she were a character in a play she never agreed to perform. He lifted the divorce papers with hands that trembled just barely, so little that no one but her would have noticed, and the gesture struck her harder than his words, because it revealed a truth she could not yet name but instantly feared. She took a cautious step toward him, wanting to speak, to demand an explanation, to claw her way through the wall he had built between them without warning, but he recoiled slightly, not out of anger, but with a quiet, tortured hesitation that confused her even more. Her heart constricted, unsure whether to interpret his movement as rejection or fear, yet each possibility carved a deeper wound than the last, leaving her stranded between disbelief and devastation. When she finally whispered his name, her voice cracked like glass under pressure, shattering into something she barely recognized as her own, and instead of answering, he closed his eyes briefly, as if acknowledging her pain would break whatever fragile resolve kept him standing. The guests shifted uncomfortably, some exchanging bewildered glances, others trying to appear discreet while openly absorbing every detail of the scene unfolding before them. She could feel their curiosity like needles against her skin, intensifying the humiliation that spread through her chest like a slow-burning flame she could not extinguish. Still, she forced herself to breathe, to remain upright, to salvage some portion of dignity even as her world fractured in plain view. One of his relatives attempted to intervene, stepping toward him with a concerned expression, but he raised a hand sharply, signaling them to stay back, and the sudden edge in his gesture caused a ripple of tension to sweep across the room. It wasn't hostility. No, it was something far more unsettling, a warning carried in silence, a barrier he refused to let anyone cross. She noticed the slight tremor in his fingers as they hovered in the air, a tremor that betrayed a fear he was desperately trying to contain, and that detail sent a strange chill down her spine. Why did he look less like a man ending a marriage and more like someone expecting imminent danger? She searched his face for answers, studying every line, every shadow, but all she found was a storm of conflicting emotions: sorrow, determination, panic, and an exhaustion so profound it seemed carved into his bones. It frightened her to see him like that, to see the man she knew transformed into a stranger carrying a weight too heavy for even his broad shoulders. And yet, beneath that terror, she sensed something else too, something she could not fully articulate, but felt with unsettling clarity. He was protecting something, protecting someone, and the realization struck her with a force that momentarily stole her breath. Still, the humiliation pressed harder than any theory she could form, because no matter how deeply she tried to read him, the undeniable truth remained. He had ended their marriage in front of everyone they loved, without warning, without compassion, without giving her even a moment to understand. Her jaw quivered as she tried to speak again, but the words tangled in her throat, suffocated by the pain swelling inside her chest, and all she could manage was a fragile, broken whisper of disbelief as he placed the papers on the table, silently urging her to sign them. And though she couldn't yet comprehend the reason, she felt instinctively that whatever he was doing, it was killing him too. She stared at the papers resting on the table, unable to lift her hand, unable to even blink, as if touching them would make the nightmare irreversible, would carve his words into reality with ink she could never wash away. Her pulse throbbed against her skin, loud and frantic, while her mind scrambled in circles trying to understand what could have driven him to orchestrate something so cruel, so public, so utterly out of character. He avoided her gaze with a stiffness that read like self-preservation, though she had the aching suspicion that it was actually something far more desperate. Fear wrapped in resignation, a secret he refused to let cross the space between them. When she finally raised her voice, it trembled so violently that she sounded like a child pleading in the dark. Instead of answering, he clasped his hands together as though anchoring himself, as if holding his own body still were the only way to prevent himself from running to her, confessing everything, undoing what he had just set in motion. The unbearable contradiction of his behavior gnawed at her. How could someone look at her with such devastation and still be the one inflicting the wound? And the more she watched him, the more she realized that there was something hollow in his chest tonight, something carved out by dread rather than apathy. Whatever he was hiding, it terrified him. That truth made her heart twist in ways she never expected. A relative stepped forward again, perhaps intending to calm the tension, but his voice broke sharply as he snapped for everyone to stay where they were, the command cracking through the room like a whip. Even the children fell silent, sensing an urgency adults often fail to hear. She recoiled at the harshness of his tone, but deeper than the shock was the recognition that his fear had just spilled through the cracks of his composure. Her breath quickened as she scanned the room, suddenly aware of the windows, the dim corners, the doors left ajar, all potential gateways for something she could not yet imagine but felt looming beyond the walls. The murmurs grew again, softer this time, tinted with unease rather than curiosity, as a few guests exchanged looks that hinted they were no longer convinced this was simply a marital catastrophe. Something about his posture spoke of a man preparing for danger, a man listening for sounds no one else could hear. She watched him tense every time a glass clinked or a chair slid, like each noise held the thread of confirming his worst fears. Her mind raced, revisiting every strange moment from the past weeks, the late-night messages he never explained, the locked office door, the sudden insistence she change her routine. At the time, she chalked it all up to emotional distance. Now, she wasn't so sure. When she took a shaky breath and stepped toward him again, his reaction made her freeze. He flinched, not in disgust, not in anger, but with a kind of protective recoil that suggested her nearness placed her in harm's way. It was then, for the first time, that she wondered whether this divorce was not about ending their life together, but about pushing her out of the line of fire. The idea struck her with an unsettling clarity, her heartbeat stuttering as the pieces began aligning in a way that terrified her more than his coldness ever could. Why would he shield her unless something or someone was closing in? But before she could ask the question forming in her throat, he exhaled with such visible torment that her own chest tightened in response. Then, as if surrendering to a force he could no longer resist, he reached for the pen and placed it near her hand. The room felt suspended as she stared at the small object, understanding that signing the document would break something sacred between them, perhaps forever, yet refusing to sign would not fix whatever shadow lurked behind his eyes. After a long, trembling moment, she lifted the pen with fingers that barely obeyed her, sensing that no matter what choice she made, the night had already begun to unravel into something far darker than anyone could comprehend. Her signature looked unreal on the page, a fragile, trembling line that did not feel like her own handwriting, as if someone else had guided her hand into sealing a fate she didn't choose. And when she finally lifted the pen, a hollow silence expanded inside her chest where her heartbeat should have been. She swallowed hard, the weight of what she had just done pressing into her lungs until breathing became an effort. And though she tried to remain composed, her vision blurred around the edges. He reached for the papers with a stiffness that bordered on anguish, his fingers curling around the edges as though the documents were heavier than any burden he had ever carried. For a fleeting second, his gaze lifted toward her, and in that quick glance, she glimpsed a sorrow so profound it made her stomach twist. The room around them felt suspended in a thick, uneasy stillness as the guests struggled to reconcile what they had witnessed with the warmth of the holiday evening they had expected. Their expressions hovered between pity and shock, whispers stirring the air like dust shaken from forgotten corners. She felt the weight of every stare, each one pricking her skin with an unspoken judgment, each murmur tightening a coil of humiliation deep inside her. Yet beneath the embarrassment, another sensation began to grow, an instinctual alarm stirred by the way he stood, shoulders taut, posture rigid, as if bracing himself against something approaching rather than recovering from what he had just done. When he turned slightly toward the front window, his eyes sharpened with the alertness of someone listening for footsteps in the dark, someone tracking a presence no one else could detect. A faint shiver danced up her spine as she followed his gaze, seeing nothing but the soft glow of Christmas lights flickering on the porch. Still, something about his expression filled the air with a cold, electric tension that made her stomach clench. One of his relatives tried to comfort her, but their words floated past her unheard, drowned beneath the echo of her racing pulse and the unexplainable fear tightening around her ribcage. As if sensing the rising anxiety in the room, he lifted a hand in a gesture that was supposed to reassure, but instead revealed how unsteady he had become. His palm trembled, subtle but undeniable, and when he curled his fingers into a fist to steady himself, she realized the tremor came not from emotion alone, but from dread. A dread that had nothing to do with the divorce and everything to do with whatever, or whoever, he feared might be watching from outside. She glanced again toward the window, her heart tightening with a creeping sense that their humiliation-filled moment had not occurred in isolation, that someone, somewhere, had been waiting for it to happen. He stepped closer to the front door, not to leave but to place himself between it and everyone else, positioning his body like a barrier, and the gesture struck her with a sudden, startling clarity. He wasn't distancing himself from her out of cruelty. He was shielding her. From what? She still didn't know, but the instinct felt undeniable. She opened her mouth to question him, to demand the truth he was so clearly hiding, but her courage faltered when she saw the wild flicker of fear in his eyes. It was not the fear of a man about to lose his marriage. It was the fear of a man anticipating violence. A knot formed in her throat as he gave a short, urgent nod toward the back of the house, a gesture subtle enough that only she noticed. It wasn't a dismissal but a warning, a desperate plea for her to leave before something irreversible occurred. Confusion battled with instinct, but before she could decipher his intention, the doorknob rattled faintly against the frame, a soft, testing sound that drained every trace of warmth from the room. A collective gasp rippled through the guests, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he squared his shoulders, the muscles in his jaw tightening with steely resolve as he made his silent choice. Whatever waited on the other side of that door, he would face it alone. She stumbled out into the cold night air, the shock of the temperature barely registering beneath the storm of emotions tearing through her chest. And for a moment she simply stood there, clutching her coat with trembling fingers as the distant hum of holiday music clashed violently with the chaos inside her mind. The neighborhood looked peaceful, draped in festive lights and quiet snow. Yet she felt as though she had stepped into a world that no longer recognized her, a world that had shifted cruelly in the span of a single heartbreaking announcement. When she finally managed to reach her car, her knees nearly buckled as she opened the door, and once she lowered herself into the driver's seat, a suffocating silence engulfed her, broken only by the sound of her unsteady breathing. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel, trying to anchor herself before the crushing reality pulled her under. Starting the engine felt like forcing life into a body that didn't want to move, and as the dashboard lights cast a pale glow across her tear-streaked cheeks, she inhaled shakily, telling herself she needed to get away, to put distance between herself and the unbearable humiliation she had endured. The tires crunched slowly over the snow as she pulled away from the curb, and with each meter she drove, the house behind her felt like a fading phantom, one that still clung to her with invisible threads of confusion and heartbreak. Streets adorned with warm golden lights blurred past her windows, but instead of bringing comfort, they seemed to mock the devastation unraveling inside her, amplifying the sense that her life had shattered in a place decorated for joy. Her thoughts swirled in chaotic loops, replaying every fragment of the night in excruciating detail. His refusal to meet her eyes, the fear shaking beneath his rigid posture, the way he positioned himself near the front door like a lone guard awaiting an unseen enemy. Each memory felt sharper now, coated with a meaning she hadn't perceived earlier, and the more she tried to piece them together, the more her unease grew. Was it really possible that the man who had broken her heart so publicly was the same man trembling under the weight of some secret danger? A tremor ran through her hands as she tightened her grip on the wheel, haunted by the suspicion that his cruelty might not have been cruelty at all. Her phone vibrating on the passenger seat jolted her from her spiraling thoughts, and she immediately slowed the car, pulling over to the side of the road as another wave of dread washed over her. She stared at the glowing screen with hesitation, noting the unfamiliar number displayed across it. In any other moment, she might have ignored it, assuming it was a mistake or an insensitive caller wanting details about the spectacle she had been forced into. But something about this number felt different, ominous in a way she could not rationalize. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she reached for the phone, fingers trembling uncontrollably. When she finally swiped to answer, the silence on the other end struck her harder than any spoken threat could have, a kind of void filled with static that whispered of someone listening, someone calculating. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could produce a word, a distorted voice emerged, low, urgent, and chillingly composed. It spoke her full name with a precision that made the blood drain from her face, as though the stranger had been waiting specifically for her to pick up. The voice told her not to return to the house, to stay away at all costs, to change direction immediately. She tried to ask who they were, why they were calling, but before her questions could form, the line went dead, cutting off the sound and leaving her stranded in a silence that felt like the breath before an explosion. Her fingers trembled as she attempted to redial, but the number appeared invalid, vanishing from her recent call list as though it had never existed. Panic prickled through her veins, quicker and sharper than before, and she felt the undeniable certainty that something far darker than heartbreak was unfolding tonight. For the first time, she allowed herself to acknowledge the terrifying possibility that her husband's strange behavior had been rooted in real danger, danger aimed directly at her. A tight knot formed in her chest, constricting her breathing as the world outside her window seemed to darken, and she realized with chilling clarity that whatever was happening was only beginning. She remained parked at the roadside for several long seconds, gripping the steering wheel as if it were the only thing preventing her from unraveling completely, her breath uneven and shallow as she tried to make sense of the warning she had just heard. The fear in that distorted voice did not sound theatrical or manipulative. It sounded informed, deliberate, and intimately aware of the danger she was in, and that alone forced her mind into a frantic race of possibilities she wasn't ready to confront. The idea that someone out there knew her name, her movements, her vulnerability, wrapped around her chest like a tightening band, suffocating every attempt at rational thought. Shadows danced across the snow-covered road as passing headlights swept by, and each one sent a jolt of dread pulsing through her veins. Her thoughts snapped back to him, to the haunted look he wore each time the door creaked or a shadow shifted, and the puzzle pieces finally began aligning into a shape she could no longer ignore. He hadn't been cold. He had been terrified. Terrified for her. Terrified of something closing in. Terrified enough to break their marriage in front of everyone just to force her out of the house. The realization shook her to her core, and as she pressed a hand against her mouth to stifle a sob, she felt the bitterness of humiliation melt into a deeper emotion, remorse. Not because he had hurt her, but because she had failed to see the fear beneath his cruelty. She restarted the engine with trembling fingers, unsure whether to drive farther away or turn back toward the home she had just escaped, caught between survival instinct and the unbearable need to understand the truth. Her eyes flicked repeatedly to the rearview mirror, convinced she might see a vehicle following her, yet the road remained eerily empty, as though the night itself were holding its breath. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a text from the same mysterious number, and as she opened the message, her pulse surged violently. It said only 2 words, "Do not look back." The simplicity of the warning made it infinitely more terrifying, as if someone was watching her right then, someone who would know whether she obeyed. But instinct overrode obedience, and her gaze shot to the mirror, expecting headlights or a shadowy figure on the road. Instead, there was nothing but endless darkness stretching behind her, the absence of movement somehow more chilling than any visible threat. Her grip tightened on the wheel, knuckles paling as the sense of being observed grew, not from the road itself, but from somewhere beyond her comprehension, a predatory presence invisible yet palpable. She swallowed hard, pulse thundering in her ears, and forced herself to breathe through the panic rising inside her chest. Whatever was happening, she couldn't remain paralyzed. She veered onto a smaller side road lined with tall trees whose branches arched overhead like skeletal arms, blocking the moonlight and plunging her path into a deeper shadow. Her headlights carved narrow tunnels of visibility through the darkness, but even that felt insufficient against the growing sense that something unseen lurked just beyond their reach, pacing her movements with unnatural patience. Every crackle of gravel beneath her tires felt amplified, every rustle in the woods sharpened into suspicion, and the cold air creeping through the vents carried a weight that made her shiver uncontrollably. As she continued down the isolated road, the crushing silence inside the car became almost unbearable, punctuated only by the frantic rhythm of her own breathing. She knew that turning back would be dangerous, but letting him face whatever was happening alone felt even more impossible. The thought of him standing in that house, trembling under the weight of a threat aimed at her, ignited a flicker of determination that cut through her fear. She could not abandon him to whatever nightmare he had been shielding her from. And so, despite the warnings echoing in her mind, she gripped the wheel with renewed resolve, unaware that at that very moment, darkness was already descending upon the home she had left behind. Back at the house, an oppressive tension wrapped itself around the living room like an invisible net, tightening with every passing second as the guests realized something far worse than a broken marriage was unfolding. He stood rooted near the front door, posture rigid, eyes fixed on the entrance with the focus of someone listening for footsteps outside, a predator's steps, slow, deliberate, and determined. The family exchanged anxious glances, stripped of their earlier confusion, now sensing the raw fear emanating from him like heat rising off pavement. Even the children grew quiet, instinctively aware that the adults no longer controlled the room. The air felt thick, charged with a dread that made every breath feel borrowed. He motioned for everyone to step back, his voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying an urgency that silenced any objections. His trembling hand hovered protectively near the doorknob, not to open it, but to brace against whatever force might attempt to breach it. A relative approached, intending to help, but he shot them a warning look, one so sharp and desperate that the person froze mid-step. There was no mistaking it now. He wasn't merely anxious. He was preparing for an intruder. Someone, or something, he believed would come through that door. His fear rippled through the room, transforming confusion into terror as the family clustered together, clinging to each other for support. Meanwhile, miles away, she gripped the steering wheel tighter as the terrible sensation of dread crawled down her spine. Something inside her, an instinct she couldn't rationalize, whispered that she needed to turn around, that leaving him behind had been a mistake she couldn't afford to let stand. Her mind replayed the way he had trembled, how his eyes darted toward the windows, how his voice cracked under the weight of something he refused to share. The broken marriage no longer felt like betrayal. It felt like a shield, hastily constructed out of desperation. And the more she thought about it, the more certain she became that he was in danger. Perhaps because of her. Perhaps because someone out there believed she was still inside that house. Back in the living room, one of his nephews reached for the curtains to peek outside, but he spun around and grabbed the boy's wrist before he could touch the fabric. The force of his grip made the child gasp, and though he apologized, the fear in his voice only heightened the panic spreading throughout the family. Whispered questions began circling. Was someone after him? After her? After all of them? But he couldn't answer. His gaze remained glued to the door, shoulders locked, muscles coiled like a drawn bowstring ready to release. His silence spoke louder than any confession could. Whatever threat loomed outside, it was real, and it was close. The room grew colder as shadows thickened along the walls, and a faint noise outside, a step on gravel, slow and deliberate, made everyone flinch. He inhaled sharply, his body reacting before his mind could catch up, and the family instinctively retreated farther from the door, as though a primal instinct were guiding them away from imminent harm. He raised a finger to his lips, demanding absolute quiet, the tremor in his hand betraying the terror pumping through his veins. That single sound, one footstep, sent shockwaves through the room. In that moment, the truth dawned on everyone. The threat hadn't been imagined. It had followed them here. She, still driving, felt a strange, piercing chill slice through her chest, a sensation so intense it forced her to slow the car. It was as though some unseen thread bound her to the house, a thread tugging harder, demanding she turn back. Tears welled in her eyes as the image of him standing alone flooded her mind. Despite everything, despite the pain, the humiliation, the unanswered questions, she knew she couldn't abandon him. To danger, to fear, to fate. With a trembling breath, she spun the wheel and turned around, unaware that while she raced toward the truth, something far darker had already stepped onto the porch of the home where he still stood, bracing himself against the inevitable. A sudden hush fell over the house when a soft but deliberate tap echoed from the front porch, a gentle knock that felt far too controlled to belong to a neighbor or a guest arriving late. It was the kind of sound designed to provoke dread, a mocking invitation rather than a request to enter. He stiffened instantly, every muscle in his body tightening as though the air itself had turned to ice around him. The family huddled closer together, their breath shallow, eyes darting between him and the door as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. The once warm, festive living room now felt like a fragile cage suspended between fear and silence. The knock repeated, slower this time, almost polite, and the eerie composure of it made the room's tension snap like a wire drawn too taut. His jaw clenched as he positioned himself more squarely in front of the entryway, shielding the others from whatever waited on the other side. Someone whispered his name, begging him not to confront the threat alone, but he didn't turn. He couldn't. The only thing that mattered was keeping them away from the door. His hand hovered just inches from the deadbolt, not to unlock it, but to brace against it, as though he feared the slightest pressure from outside might force it open. Miles away, she accelerated, sensing with every fiber of her being that she was running out of time. Her heart pounded with a rhythm that felt synchronized with the danger unfolding at home, as though some invisible connection kept transmitting bursts of urgency into her chest. The headlights illuminated the empty road ahead, but her mind kept replaying the terror in his eyes, the strained silence, the way he seemed to anticipate an attack long before she had any clue. It was no longer simply a matter of heartbreak or betrayal. Something was hunting them, something he had tried to fight by himself. The realization made her grip the wheel even tighter, willing the car to go faster. Back in the house, the faint crunch of gravel outside announced a shift in the intruder's position, and that subtle movement was enough to send a shudder through everyone. He turned his head slightly, listening with the precision of someone who had memorized the patterns of a predator, and after a moment, he whispered a single command: "Stay away from the windows." The trembling in his voice betrayed the absolute certainty behind the warning. One of his relatives covered her mouth to stifle a sob, while another pulled the children closer, trying to create a protective shield of arms around them. But no one, not even he, truly believed they could stop whatever was out there. A low vibration buzzed in his pocket, startling him. He fumbled for his phone and saw the same anonymous number that had contacted her earlier. He answered immediately, turning away from the family to shield them from what he might hear. The distorted voice whispered urgently, telling him the intruder had reached the house and that opening the door under any circumstances would be fatal. He swallowed hard as the final instruction hit him like a blow: evacuate through the back. He looked over his shoulder at the terrified faces behind him and knew instantly what he had to do. If he could keep the intruder focused on him, even for a moment, the others would have a chance. But as he prepared to move, he noticed something chilling through the faint crack beneath the door, the shifting outline of a shadow. It stood motionless at first, then subtly adjusted its stance, as if studying the interior with calm, hunting patience. His pulse surged as he realized the intruder wasn't simply knocking or waiting, it was evaluating, calculating, searching for him. The family's survival depended on him drawing that menace away, and he understood, with a sinking certainty, that no matter how the night ended, he would not be walking out of this house. He inhaled deeply, bracing himself for the confrontation that destiny had carved for him long before this moment. He gathered the family with hurried gestures, urging them toward the back of the house, while keeping his body angled protectively toward the front door, as if expecting it to burst inward at any second. Fear flickered in their eyes, yet they obeyed without resistance, sensing that arguing would only waste precious time they no longer had. His voice was low but firm, instructing them to move quietly, to avoid drawing attention, to run once they reached the yard. The children clung to their parents, trembling, while the adults hovered in a state of disbelief, struggling to understand how an evening meant for celebration had turned into a nightmare. He didn't look at them long. Lingering meant hesitation, and hesitation could cost lives. As they crept down the hallway, a violent thud reverberated through the living room, the sound of the intruder testing the door's remaining strength. The walls seemed to quiver under the force, dust drifting from the ceiling as if the house itself were bracing for impact. Someone let out a quiet cry, quickly muffled by a trembling hand. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself not to look back, because he knew his instinct to protect his family would pull him away from what he needed to do: hold the thread at the front long enough for them to escape. Another strike hit the door, deeper, more decisive, and he felt the vibrations travel through the floorboards into his bones. They reached the kitchen at last, where the back door offered a narrow corridor of hope framed by the cold night beyond. He opened it with careful urgency, ushering them out one by one, giving quick instructions to stay low and keep moving. His mother hesitated, tears streaking her cheeks as she grabbed his arm, begging him to come with them. For a moment his resolve faltered under the weight of her fear, but then another thunderous blow shook the front of the house, sharper and closer. The intruder was breaching. He cupped his mother's face gently, whispering a promise he knew he couldn't keep, urging her to run. And with one final push, he sent her into the darkness with the rest of the family, closing the door behind them. Alone once more, the silence pressed in on him like a physical force. He leaned against the kitchen counter for a moment, drawing a deep, steadying breath while the distant scrape of the front door's hinges signaled the beginning of the final confrontation. His heartbeat pulsed wildly in his ears, but behind it lay a quiet certainty. This was the moment he had feared, the moment he had prepared for, the moment he had sacrificed everything, including his marriage, to survive long enough to protect her. Memories of her smile, her laughter, their shared years, flickered through his mind like scenes from another life, each one adding a layer of steel to his spine. Then the sound came, a crack, sharp and decisive, as the front door finally gave way. He straightened, forcing his trembling legs to carry him back toward the living room, each step deliberate despite the terror gnawing at his insides. The air felt colder now, infused with a darkness that moved with intention. As he approached the doorway, he could see the silhouette entering the house, its movements slow and calculated, like a predator savoring the moment before the strike. He ducked behind the edge of the couch, muscles coiled, waiting for the intruder to reveal just enough of its position for him to act. He knew he couldn't defeat it, but he didn't need to. He only had to delay it. Meanwhile, she sped through the streets, guided by a sense of urgency so powerful it drowned out every warning the mysterious caller had given her. Her heart hammered as she imagined him alone in that house, facing whatever nightmare had driven him to destroy their marriage. She gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white, whispering frantic prayers that she wasn't too late. The night seemed to blur around her as she drove faster, unaware that with each passing second, destiny was pulling her toward a truth far more devastating than anything she had feared, and toward a final moment that would change her understanding of love forever. The intruder stepped deeper into the living room, its silhouette stretching across the floor like a stain of darkness swallowing the soft glow of the Christmas lights. He crouched behind the couch, breath shallow, heart pounding in a violent rhythm that echoed in his ears, yet his mind sharpened with one final surge of resolve. He rose just enough to catch a glimpse of the figure, tall, deliberate, moving with the confidence of someone who already knew the outcome of the night. The intruder paused, scanning the room with predatory precision, and in that moment he understood that if he didn't draw the threat's attention fully, it would eventually search the rest of the house and discover the family fleeing out back. He had seconds, maybe less, to make a choice that would determine who survived. Summoning strength he didn't know he still possessed, he lunged from his hiding spot and shouted, a raw, desperate sound meant to redirect the intruder's focus entirely onto him. The figure reacted instantly, its head snapping toward the noise, eyes gleaming with recognition rather than surprise. He stumbled backward, buying distance, and threw whatever objects he could reach, a vase, a lamp, anything, to force the intruder to follow him away from the corridor leading to the yard. Each crash echoed through the house, fueling the urgency of their confrontation. His muscles burned, his breathing grew ragged, but he didn't stop. The only path forward was sacrifice, and he embraced it without hesitation. Meanwhile, she turned onto their street, her headlights illuminating the familiar rooftops as dread crashed through her with unbearable force. The house loomed at the end of the block, quiet yet ominously lit from within by a faint, trembling glow. Something was wrong, horribly, irreversibly wrong. She pressed harder on the accelerator, whispering fragments of prayers and apologies, her chest tight with the horrible suspicion that she had misunderstood everything about him, about the divorce, about the danger. She didn't care about the pain he had caused anymore. She only cared that he might be trapped inside, facing something meant for her. Her heart felt as if it would burst through her ribs as she sped toward the driveway. Inside, the struggle escalated with brutal speed. The intruder lunged again, faster this time, and he barely dodged the blow, feeling the icy air of the strike brush against his ribs. Pain shot through his side as he collided with the corner of a table, but he forced himself upright, blocking the intruder's path with his body. He didn't fight with skill. He fought with devotion, a desperate ferocity born from love and fear intertwined. For a moment, he managed to throw the intruder off balance, slamming a shoulder into the figure to redirect its momentum. But the advantage lasted only a heartbeat. The intruder recovered with chilling composure, stepping forward with silent, lethal intent. He knew then, with absolute, devastating clarity, that he wouldn't survive the next blow. His legs trembled, his breaths came in sharp, burning gasps, but he stood tall, positioning himself directly between the intruder and the hallway leading to the back door. His final act was simple and instinctive. He raised his hands, as if his body alone could be a barrier strong enough to protect the woman he loved and the family who now fled into the night. The intruder struck with merciless force, and time seemed to fracture as the impact drove him backward, stealing the air from his lungs and sending him crashing to the floor. His vision blurred, the world narrowing to a tunnel of dim lights and fading shapes. She burst through the front door moments later, breathless and frantic, her eyes widening in horror as she saw him lying motionless on the floor, the intruder gone as swiftly as it had appeared. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands trembling uncontrollably as she touched his face, begging him to wake up, to breathe, to look at her once more. But his eyes remained still, half open, reflecting the faint glow of the Christmas lights. Her gaze fell to his phone beside his hand, its screen illuminated with a final message he never had time to send. "I did this for you." The truth struck her with unbearable force. Every cruel word, every cold act, every moment of distance had been a shield protecting her from a threat she never saw coming. And now, the cost of his love lay silent in her arms. She stayed beside him long after the echoes of the struggle faded, her hands trembling as they held a body still warm but unmistakably lifeless, her tears falling onto the floorboards in quiet streams that carried the weight of everything she had failed to see. Around her, the living room looked frozen in time, strewn objects, broken decorations, scattered glass, all fragments of a battle he had fought alone while she, unaware, drove away in heartbreak. The truth settled over her like a crushing tide. Every distant glance, every cold word, every trembling moment she mistook for cruelty had been his last attempt to protect her from a danger that had stalked them long before this night. His final choice had not been abandonment. It had been love in its most devastating form. She leaned over him, whispering apologies between sobs, tracing the outline of his face with a tenderness that came too late, wishing she could turn back the clock even a single hour to tell him she understood, that she believed him, that she trusted him, that she would have stood by his side no matter what hunted them. Outside, faint sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer with every passing moment, but she barely heard them. All she could focus on was the weight of his sacrifice pressing against her heart, binding her to a loyalty he had carried to the very end. As she rested her forehead against his, she felt something inside her break in a way she knew would never fully heal. When the family eventually returned, guided by the flashing lights approaching the house, they found her curled around him on the floor, her grief so raw and profound that none of them could bear to speak. They gathered quietly around her, their silent tears joining hers as the full magnitude of what he had done revealed itself piece by piece. He had never meant to hurt her. He had tried to save her. And in doing so, he had given everything he had left. The realization cast a long shadow over the room, turning every Christmas light into a painful reminder of the life he had fought to protect. In the days that followed, she carried his final message with her everywhere, not as a wound, but as a vow she intended to honor. She learned to see the world through the lens of the man who had loved her so fiercely that he became the villain in order to be her shield. She held on to the belief that not all endings are failures. Some are sacrifices written in silence, meant to ensure another life can continue even when the givers cannot. And though the loss carved a permanent ache in her chest, it also ignited a quiet strength inside her, a strength born from the love he left behind. If this story moved you and made you reflect on the unseen battles people fight in silence, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice helps keep these stories alive. And if you want to receive more emotional, cinematic narratives like this one, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another tale that touches the heart and reveals the deeper truths hidden in ordinary lives.